The memories of that deployment still haunt me. The endless Iraqi desert stretches through my nightmares like an ocean of sand, hiding secrets that should have remained buried. I've waited years to tell this story, not because I wanted to forget, but because I needed time to accept that what happened was real. This is my account of the horrors we encountered during our deployment to Iraq in 2006. I was Sergeant Ethan Davis, leader of a platoon stationed at Forward Operating Base Dragon. The base sat like a lonely outpost in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by rolling dunes and the occasional cluster of abandoned buildings. The morning sun would rise over the horizon, turning the sky into a canvas of orange and red, beautiful but threatening, as if warning us that beauty in this place came with a price. Our team was solid. We had Corporal Jack Miller, everyone called him Jax, our communications specialist who could find humor in almost anything. Private Mark Harrison, who we called Doc, was our medic. He had this calming presence that made even the worst situations bearable. Specialist Rosa Vasquez served as our engineer, brilliant and methodical in everything she did. Private First Class Lucas Reed was the newest addition to our team, young and eager to prove himself. Watching over us all was Sergeant Major William Kingston, or Billy as he preferred, a veteran with more desert sand in his boots than most of us had years in service. The first month was routine: patrols, checkpoint operations, the occasional interaction with locals. The heat was our biggest enemy, along with the boredom that came between missions. But everything changed when we received orders to secure a village near an archaeological site about 20 miles from our base. The village itself was like many others we'd seen: mud brick buildings weathered by sand and time, narrow alleys that wound between structures like veins in ancient stone. But beyond the village stood the ruins of what must have been a magnificent temple thousands of years ago. The remaining walls rose from the sand like the ribs of some long-dead beast, worn limestone blocks covered in eroded carvings that hinted at their former glory. "Place gives me the creeps," Jack said as we approached, his usual smile replaced by an uncharacteristic frown. "Something about those carvings doesn't sit right." I understood what he meant. The few visible symbols seemed to twist in your peripheral vision, like they were changing when you weren't looking directly at them. But we had a job to do, and archaeological oddities weren't going to stop us from completing our mission. The temple interior was cooler than expected, offering relief from the punishing sun. Our boots left prints in sand that probably hadn't been disturbed in centuries. The beam from our flashlights caught dust particles dancing in the air, creating halos of light that made the atmosphere feel almost mystical. "Sarge, you need to see this," Rosa called out from what appeared to be a partially collapsed wall. She was kneeling beside a section where the sand had shifted, revealing what looked like a hidden chamber. "The architecture here doesn't match the rest of the structure. This section is older, much older." We cleared away more sand, revealing a narrow opening. The air that escaped from within carried a musty, ancient smell, but there was something else, a metallic tang that made the back of my throat itch. Kingston stood behind us, his weathered face showing concern. "Maybe we ought to leave this one alone," he suggested, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "Some things stay buried for a reason." But military protocol required us to check any hidden spaces for potential weapons caches or intelligence materials. I made the call to investigate, a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The chamber beyond the opening was small, maybe 15 feet square, with walls made of stone so dark it seemed to absorb our flashlight beams. In the center, partially buried in the sand, was an object that would change everything: a tablet, roughly 2 feet by 3 feet, made of a material none of us could identify. It wasn't stone, wasn't metal, but something in between that seemed to hold a dull sheen even in the darkness. Rosa approached it first, her training as an engineer evident in her cautious examination. "These markings, they're like nothing I've ever seen. They're not cuneiform, not hieroglyphics. They don't match any ancient writing system I know of." The symbols covered the tablet's surface in spiraling patterns that seemed to draw your eye inward, making you want to trace them with your finger. Lucas reached out to do just that, but I grabbed his wrist before he could make contact. Standard procedure, I reminded him. We document it, photograph it, and if necessary, we bag it for analysis. No direct contact without proper clearance. But even as I said those words, I felt something, a subtle vibration in the air, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the atmosphere becomes charged with electricity. Doc, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "Anyone else feel that?" he asked, his medical training making him particularly attuned to physical sensations. "It's like pressure in my ears." We all felt it, though none of us wanted to admit it. The air had become heavy, almost oppressive, and the darkness beyond our flashlight beams seemed deeper than it should have been. Kingston took a step backward, his hand instinctively moving to his weapon. "Wrap it up," he ordered, his voice tight. "Whatever this is, we're taking it back to base for proper analysis." We carefully extracted the tablet from the sand and secured it in a transport bag. As we did, the pressure in the chamber increased, making our ears pop. The darkness seemed to pulse just at the edge of vision, like something stirring from a long sleep. That was the moment everything changed. That was the moment we unknowingly set something free, something that had been bound in that chamber for thousands of years. We just didn't know it yet. The walk back to our vehicles felt longer than it should have. The sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of purple and deep red. The wind had picked up, carrying grains of sand that stung our exposed skin. But it wasn't just sand in that wind. There was something else, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Jax was the first to mention it. "You guys hear that?" he asked as we loaded our gear. "Sounds like whispers." We all paused to listen. The wind moved around us, carrying what could have been voices just at the edge of hearing. Or maybe it was just the sound of sand moving across sand. None of us wanted to acknowledge what we thought we heard. Our names carried on the desert breeze, spoken in voices that seemed both ancient and impossibly close. That night, back at Forward Operating Base Dragon, would be our last normal night, though we didn't know it then. The tablet was secured in a storage unit, waiting for proper archaeological analysis. But as I lay in my bunk, trying to sleep, I could swear I heard those whispers again, clearer now, speaking words in a language that had been dead for millennia. And somewhere in the darkness beyond our base, something was watching, waiting, preparing to show us that some discoveries come with a price that no one should have to pay. The changes began subtly at first. The morning after we brought the tablet back, our equipment started acting strangely. Radio communications became filled with static, punctuated by sounds that shouldn't have been there. What seemed like whispers in ancient languages, or the echoes of distant screams. Our night vision goggles showed moving shadows where there should have been nothing but empty desert. Rosa spent every free moment studying the tablet, her initial excitement giving way to growing concern. She had set up a makeshift research station in the storage unit, surrounding herself with reference books and archaeological guides. I found her there late one night, her face illuminated by her laptop screen, her usually neat appearance disheveled from hours of work. "These symbols," she said without looking up as I entered. "They're not just writing, they're some kind of warning." She pointed to a series of marks that seemed to shift and change even as I looked at them. "I've cross-referenced every known ancient writing system. This predates all of them. This is older than Sumerian, older than anything we've ever found." Before I could respond, the lights in the storage unit flickered and died, plunging us into darkness broken only by the glow of her laptop. The temperature dropped so suddenly I could see our breath in the air. In that moment, I swear I heard something moving in the darkness. Not the sound of human footsteps, but something that seemed to slide across the floor like sand being pushed by the wind. The backup generator kicked in after a few seconds, restoring light to the room. Rosa and I exchanged glances, both knowing that what we'd just experienced wasn't normal, wasn't something that could be explained by faulty wiring or desert conditions. "There's more," Rosa said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The locals have stories, ancient ones passed down through generations. They speak of something that lives in the deep desert, something their ancestors imprisoned beneath the earth. They call it Arakthar, the Soul Eater. That same night, Lucas had his first nightmare. His screams woke half the base, bringing Doc running to the barracks. We found Lucas tangled in his sheets, his eyes wide with terror, his skin covered in a cold sweat that seemed to freeze in the inexplicably cold air. "The faces," he kept saying over and over. "The faces in the sand. They're calling to us. They're hungry." Doc gave him a sedative, but as he was administering it, I noticed something on Lucas's arm. Marks that looked like ancient symbols, similar to those on the tablet, appearing on his skin like bruises rising to the surface. When Doc tried to photograph them for his medical report, the images came out blurred and distorted, as if something was interfering with the camera. Jax tried to lighten the mood the next morning, but his jokes fell flat. Even he couldn't ignore the growing sense of wrongness that seemed to permeate the base. During his communications shift, he started hearing things in his headset, voices calling his name in perfect Arabic, despite the fact that our channels were secure and limited to our own forces. "It knows us, Sarge," he told me, his usual smile gone. "Whatever it is, it knows our names, knows things about us that it shouldn't. Last night, it spoke about my sister in Kansas, knew about the scar she got when we were kids. Nobody here knows about that. Nobody." Kingston pulled me aside after morning briefing, his weathered face more serious than usual. "This isn't my first rodeo with something like this," he said, his voice low to avoid being overheard. "Back in '91, during the Gulf War, we found something out in the deep desert. Different from this, but similar enough. 3 men in my unit died before we figured out what we were dealing with. Some things in this desert are older than time, Sergeant, and they don't take kindly to being disturbed." I wanted to dismiss it all, the voices, the nightmares, the impossible cold in the middle of the Iraqi desert. But then I saw it myself during a perimeter check at dusk. Something moved across the sand in a way that defied physics, like a shadow flowing against the wind. As I watched, it took shape for just a moment, a form that hurt my eyes to look at, composed of swirling darkness and what looked like faces trapped in the void, their mouths open in silent screams. When I raised my rifle, the shape dissolved back into the sand, but not before I heard its voice in my head, speaking words that felt like ice in my veins. "You have freed us. The binding is broken. Now you will feed us as all things must." The sun set that evening in a sky that seemed to bleed, the clouds tinted an unnatural shade of red. As darkness fell, we could hear something moving in the desert beyond our walls. Something large, something ancient, something that had waited millennia to hunt again. The night wind carried the sound of its hunger, and we all knew, deep in our souls, that our war had changed. We were no longer fighting an enemy we could shoot or bomb. We were facing something that had been old when humanity first crawled out of the darkness, something that wanted to drag us back into that darkness, one soul at a time. Jax was the first to disappear. He was on night watch at the eastern perimeter, maintaining regular radio contact every 15 minutes. His last transmission still haunts me. "Something's out here, Sarge." His voice crackled through the radio, tense but controlled. "About 200 meters out. I can't. It's hard to describe what I'm seeing." There was a pause, filled only by his breathing. "The sand is moving wrong. It's flowing uphill, and there's something in it, something dark." The radio erupted with static, pierced by a sound that might have been a scream. By the time we reached his position, all we found was his rifle, half buried in sand that was somehow ice cold despite the desert heat. His night vision goggles lay nearby, the lens cracked, still recording. When we reviewed the footage later, all we saw was a mass of darkness rising from the sand, full of twisted faces and reaching hands, before the video dissolved into static. Doc examined Lucas the next morning, growing increasingly concerned about the symbols appearing on his skin. They were spreading, moving like ink beneath his flesh, and Lucas's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. He spoke in languages none of us recognized, his voice changing in pitch and tone as if multiple people were speaking through him. "They're hungry," he said during one of his more lucid moments, his eyes focusing on something none of us could see. "They've been trapped for so long, and now they're so hungry. Arakthar isn't just one thing, it's many, countless, infinite, and it wants us all." Rosa worked frantically to decipher more of the tablet's text. Knowing we were running out of time, the temperature around the base dropped lower each night, creating impossible frost patterns on the windows that looked like screaming faces. The generator failed more frequently, leaving us in darkness that felt alive, that seemed to reach for us with ghostly hands. The tablet isn't just a warning, Rosa explained during an emergency meeting. It's a record of how they bound this thing the first time. The priests of some pre-Sumerian civilization found a way to trap a Rakthar beneath the earth, using rituals and sacrifices that... She paused, her face pale. The cost was high, but they managed to imprison it. When we removed the tablet, we broke the binding. Our attempts to fight back proved futile. Bullets passed through the shadow creatures like smoke. Grenades scattered their forms momentarily, only to have them reform, larger and more grotesque. We tried to establish contact with our main base, but all communications were blocked by an endless stream of whispers and screams. Kingston suggested fortifying the base with salt lines and ancient symbols Rosa had translated, but we were already too late. During a particularly dark night, the shadows breached our defenses. The darkness came alive, flowing like water against gravity, forming into shapes that defied sanity. I watched in horror as one of our younger soldiers was enveloped by a mass of writhing shadows. His scream cut off abruptly, and when the darkness retreated, he remained standing, but empty. His eyes were black voids and his shadow moved independently, reaching for others nearby. Doc tried to help him, but the moment he touched the soldier's skin, he recoiled as if burned. "He's ice cold," Doc reported, his medical training warring with the impossible reality before us. No pulse, no breathing, but he's still standing. It's like his soul is gone. The transformed soldier began speaking in that ancient language, his voice overlapping with others, countless voices emerging from one throat. He walked jerkily toward us, his movements wrong, his shadow stretching and twisting into impossible shapes. We had no choice. I gave the order, and Kingston put him down with a single shot. The body crumbled to sand, but the shadow remained, laughing in 1,000 voices before sliding away into the darkness. Rosa believed she had found a solution, but the cost would be terrible. The original binding ritual required a sacrifice, a soul freely given to hold the entity in its prison. The tablet contained the ritual words, the patterns that needed to be drawn, but it would mean returning to that temple, to the very heart of Arakthar's power. "We have to try," she insisted, her voice shaking but determined. "If we don't, this thing will spread. It won't stop with us. It will keep hunting, keep feeding, keep growing stronger. The whole world could fall into darkness." The desert beyond our base had changed, becoming something alien and wrong. The dunes moved like waves in an ocean of damned souls, and strange lights danced on the horizon, drawing unwary eyes toward certain doom. We could hear Jax's voice sometimes, calling for help, but we knew it wasn't really him anymore. Whatever spoke with his voice was just another facet of the ancient horror we had unleashed. Our journey back to the temple was a nightmare. With only 5 of us left, myself, Kingston, Rosa, Doc, and a barely coherent Lucas, we loaded the tablet into our Humvee and set out just before dawn. The rising sun offered no comfort. Its light seemed weak and distant, as if something was consuming it before it could reach the earth. The desert fought us every step of the way. Sand whirled up in impossible patterns, forming barriers and pitfalls. The air itself felt thick, resisting our movement, filled with whispers that grew louder as we approached our destination. The temple ruins rose before us like the bones of some ancient leviathan, casting shadows that moved against the light. "Keep moving," Kingston ordered as we approached the entrance. "Whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't stop." His voice carried the weight of experience, of someone who had faced darkness before and survived, but even he couldn't hide his fear. Lucas suddenly grabbed my arm, his eyes clear for the first time in days. "They're all around us," he whispered. "The ones it took. They're trapped in there with it. Jax." I can hear him screaming. The temple interior had transformed. The walls writhed with shadow forms, faces pressing through the stone-like cloth, mouths opening in silent screams. The air grew colder with each step, our breath forming clouds that twisted into horrifying shapes before dissipating. Rosa clutched the tablet, her knuckles white. "The binding chamber," she said, pointing toward the dark opening we'd found days earlier. "The ritual has to be performed there. It's where they bound it the first time." As we descended into the chamber, our flashlight beams seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The walls were covered in symbols that glowed with a sickly light, pulsing like a dying heartbeat. The chamber had grown impossibly large, stretching into darkness that shouldn't have existed underground. Then we saw it, Arakthar in its true form. The entity rose from the darkness like a mountain of shadow and pain, composed of countless writhing forms. Faces emerged from its surface, some we recognized, others ancient beyond imagining, all twisted in eternal agony. At its center was a void, a darkness so complete it seemed to pull at our souls. "You have brought the binding stone," it spoke, its voice a chorus of thousands. "You think to imprison us again, to send us back to our endless hunger." The thing that had once been Jax emerged from its mass, his form flickering between human and shadow. "Join us instead. Share in our feast. Your souls will live forever in our eternal darkness." Rosa began the ritual, her voice strong despite her terror. She drew the symbols on the chamber floor with a mixture of sand and her own blood, recreating the patterns shown on the tablet. The entity reacted violently, sending waves of shadow forms to stop her. Kingston and I fired into the mass, our bullets passing through but somehow holding it back, each shot accompanied by inhuman screams. Doc protected Rosa, using salt and iron to create a barrier, but the effort cost him. One of the shadow tendrils touched his arm, and I watched in horror as darkness spread through his veins like poison. Still, he maintained the barrier, even as his skin grew pale and his eyes began to darken. "The portal must be sealed with a living soul," Rosa shouted over the howling chaos. "A willing sacrifice to hold the binding." She looked at each of us, her eyes filled with tears. "It has to be me. I released it. I have to." "No," Lucas stepped forward, his body covered in glowing symbols that matched those on the tablet. "It's been preparing me for this. That's what the marks mean. I'm already part of it, but I can still choose. I can use that connection to lock it away forever." Before any of us could stop him, Lucas stepped into the center of Rosa's ritual circle. The symbols on his skin blazed with blinding light, and he began speaking in that ancient language, his voice resonating with power that shook the chamber. Arakthar shrieked, a sound that made reality itself shudder. The entity tried to flee, but the ritual circle erupted with light, forming chains of energy that began pulling the darkness into the void. The faces in its surface screamed as they were dragged back into imprisonment, all except those it had taken most recently. I saw Jax one last time, his face peaceful as his soul was finally released, along with the others it had consumed since being freed. Lucas looked at me one last time, somehow smiling despite the pain. "Tell my family I did something important," he said. Then his body dissolved into light, becoming the seal that would hold Arakthar in its prison for another age of the world. The chamber began collapsing as soon as the binding was complete. We barely escaped, carrying Doc between us, his arm still darkened, but the spread of shadow stopped by the entity's imprisonment. The tablet had crumbled to dust, its purpose fulfilled. The drive back to base was silent. The desert had returned to normal, or what passed for normal in that sun-scorched part of the world. The wind no longer carried whispers and the sand stayed where it should, no longer flowing like water or reaching with hungry fingers toward us. But we were changed. Some horrors leave marks that no amount of time can erase. Doc's arm never fully recovered. The darkness in his veins faded to a dull gray, leaving intricate patterns that looked almost like ancient script. The doctors at the military hospital couldn't explain it, and eventually listed it as a mysterious chemical burn in their reports. But I would sometimes catch him staring at those marks, his medical training warring with the impossible knowledge of what had really caused them. Kingston retired soon after, but he made sure to track down every member of his old unit from the Gulf War who had experienced similar phenomena. He created an unofficial network of veterans who had seen the things that lurk in the deep desert, making sure their stories were preserved, even if they could never be officially acknowledged. Rosa threw herself into research, trying to find other mentions of Arakthar or similar entities in ancient texts. She would send me emails sometimes, heavily encrypted, about patterns she had discovered in historical accounts of disappearances and inexplicable events across the Middle East. But she never went back into the field. Some doors once opened can never be fully closed. The official report about what happened at FOB Dragon cited environmental factors and mass hysteria to explain the losses we suffered. Jax was listed as killed in action, his body unrecoverable due to environmental conditions. Lucas's sacrifice was recorded as a casualty from an insurgent attack. The truth was buried deeper than the temple had been, hidden under layers of bureaucracy and denial. But the truth has a way of lingering, of whispering in the dark corners of memory. I still dream about it sometimes. In my dreams, I see Lucas's face in that final moment, glowing with ancient symbols as he gave himself to save not just us, but the entire world from what we had unleashed. I see Jax's soul being freed from that writhing mass of darkness, finding peace at last. I see the countless faces in Arakthar's surface, centuries of victims trapped in its endless hunger. The experiences changed how I see the world. The hard lines between possible and impossible, between natural and supernatural, are not as clear as I once believed. There are things in this world that are older than humanity's oldest civilizations, things that wait in dark places, hungry and patient. Sometimes at night, when the wind blows just right, I think I hear whispers in a language that no living person knows. It makes me wonder if the binding will hold, if Lucas's sacrifice will be enough to keep Arakthar imprisoned for another age of the world. I've never returned to Iraq, though my duties in the military continued for several years after the incident. I couldn't bring myself to go back to that desert, to face those endless sands that might still hide other ancient horrors waiting to be discovered. Some veterans carry physical scars from their service, others carry psychological wounds that time slowly heals. But a few of us carry a different kind of burden, the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more terrifying than most people imagine. The others who survived that night stay in touch. We don't talk much about what happened, but we understand each other in a way that nobody else can. Sometimes, one of us will notice something in the news, unexplained disappearances in remote areas, strange phenomena in ancient ruins, and we'll check on each other, making sure we're all still okay, still holding up under the weight of our memories. Kingston passed away last year. At his funeral, I noticed his grandson wearing a familiar pendant, a small silver amulet with protective symbols that Rosa had designed based on her research. The old sergeant major had made sure his family would have some protection, even if they never knew exactly what they were being protected from. Doc still practices medicine, though he moved to a small town in Montana, as far from the desert as he could get. His patients sometimes ask about the strange marks on his arm, and he tells them it's an experimental tattoo. But I know he keeps a journal where he documents any unusual symptoms or inexplicable conditions he encounters in his practice, just in case. Rosa occasionally sends me updates on her research, each one encrypted with military-grade security. Her last message mentioned patterns of disappearances throughout history that match what we experienced. She believes there might be other entities out there, other ancient horrors waiting to be discovered. But she's also found evidence of people who fought them, contained them, kept humanity safe from things we were never meant to encounter. As for me, I still serve, but now I do what I can to prevent others from discovering things that should stay buried. When reports come in about strange ruins or unusual phenomena in combat zones, I make sure they're thoroughly investigated before any personnel are allowed near them. Most turn out to be nothing, just the desert playing tricks or the ordinary horrors of war casting shadows. But sometimes, when I read about ancient chambers discovered in remote places or unusual symbols found carved in stone, I feel that familiar chill down my spine. The world has enough horrors without adding ancient, hungry ones to the mix, so I keep watch, remembering Lucas's sacrifice, honoring Jax's memory, and doing what I can to make sure that what happened to us doesn't happen to anyone else. Because some wars aren't fought with guns and bombs, but with knowledge and sacrifice, in dark places where the very soul of humanity hangs in the balance. And somewhere in the deep desert, buried in darkness and bound by one brave soul's sacrifice, Arakthar waits, its hunger endless, its patience infinite. The binding holds for now, but in my darkest moments, I wonder, for how long?